All right, now let's get the very latest from the U.S. Our correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, joins us now live from New York. Sherwin, thank you so much for your time. At this stage, I mean, these imminent arrest warrant reports, which are yet to be confirmed, I might add, by the ICC, come as the criminal court has, for the past 7 months, in fact, been investigating Hamas October attacks as well as Israel's military assault on Gaza. I mean, as pressure continues to mount globally against Israel, what's been the response around this latest development?
Well, let's just take a step back here, Unati, right? We have not heard, as you correctly point out in that question, confirmation from Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, that they are in fact planning to indict several senior leaders in Israel, including the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. What we have seen, though, over the weekend, starting with a tweet, a post on X by the Prime Minister, are indications that this might well be in the offing. We've seen a lot of reporting from Israeli media referring to their sourcing within the Israeli government, speaking to the fact that this might very well be happening. You've heard from publications like the Times of Israel, Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post. It was then picked up by the New York Times, and then a number of U.S. media started picking up the story over the weekend, essentially that Israeli officials believe the ICC is preparing arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, including the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and the IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi. But of course, this again has not been confirmed by Karim Khan, the prosecutor. What he has said in October last year was to affirm the fact that the ICC had jurisdiction over the Palestinian occupied territories. Remember, Palestine submitted its signature to the Rome Statute, the treaty that that founded the ICC, that countries like South Africa are also signatories to, have ratified the document. So they have jurisdiction over crimes that were committed by Hamas in the Palestinian occupied territories, but also by the IDF. And I think it's also important at this juncture to really separate what might be some confusion out there, right? You have the ICJ process, the International Court of Justice, focused on disputes between states. So the most recent example, South Africa versus Israel, as it pertains to the 1948 Genocide Convention, which South Africa believes Israel is violating. In this instance, what you won't see is the state per se on trial, were Karim Khan to move forward here, but individual responsibility for crimes against humanity, for war crimes, crimes of genocide. Similar to what you've seen most recently in terms of indictments against the Russian Federation, including President Vladimir Putin in relation to the transfer of children from Ukraine to Russia during the conflict in Ukraine. Russia, too, is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. It therefore will argue that the ICC does not have jurisdiction over Russia. What the ICC says is Ukraine has given us jurisdiction over crimes committed in that territory, and that'll be a similar argument that Karim Khan will use in terms of pursuit of any Israeli officials, that they have jurisdiction over crimes committed in the Palestinian territories because Palestine has submitted its signature and ratified the Rome Statute. Unati.
Well, of course, you might have heard the presidency, just responding to what we are hearing now. South Africa saying that, in fact, it will continue to put pressure on Israel through its ICJ as well as the ICC processes. Just talk to us perhaps about, just in terms of the latest. We know that Anthony Blinken is again in the Middle East. He is going to have talks first in Saudi Arabia. He is going to meet Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, next week, we are told. Just in terms of the latest on how countries have been putting pressure on Israel and, how that is going so far.
Well, the pressure hasn't stopped, right? No less the pressure that was exerted through that ICJ process by South Africa, but there have been various attempts here at ceasefire resolutions within the Security Council. Some have passed, some have failed. There was an attempt by the Palestinians to seek full recognition in terms of full membership of the UN. That continues, although it failed, it continues to place a spotlight on processes in terms of the broader issue here, which is an independent Palestinian state living side by side against an independent and sovereign Israeli state living, in peace and security. But of course, these processes, although they don't necessarily deliver the results, they do continue to put the spotlight on what has been happening in the Middle East since October 7th. I can also tell you that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had a call with US President Joe Biden over the weekend, and part of the readout that we got from the White House is that the President and the Prime Minister also discussed increases in the delivery of humanitarian assistance into Gaza, including through preparations to open new northern crossings starting this week. The President also stressed the need for this progress to be sustained and enhanced in full coordination with humanitarian organizations. Why is that so important in the context of the ICC? Because the Times of Israel is reporting, and various other media are reporting, that the ICC is particularly looking at an allegation that Israel deliberately blocked humanitarian aid from getting into the Gaza Strip, or at least at the very least slow walking that aid, that has then led to the starvation of Palestinians in Gaza. That appears to be what the thrust of any ICC indictment would be, right? What are they accusing the Israelis here of doing? They're saying of slow walking or blocking aid that led to Palestinians starving in Gaza. So these are some of the permutations. These are some of the elements. But as I say, this is speculation based on reporting and sourcing that the ICC is yet to confirm. Of course, there are broader implications here as to what that would mean for Israeli officials. What would it mean specifically for a prime minister and his ability to engage with world leaders around the world were he to be indicted by the ICC? What is our guide here? Look at how Vladimir Putin has been isolated, right? You remember he was unable to travel to the BRICS summit in South Africa due to South Africa being a signatory to the Rome Statute and having an obligation then to effect an arrest were a warrant to be issued and an indictee were to set foot in a jurisdiction that is under the Rome Statute, which would exactly be the case were the Israeli Prime Minister, for example, to travel to the United Kingdom, to many countries in Europe, many other countries in Africa. So his travel will be limited, his reach would be limited. So this would have very real implications for how this Israeli Prime Minister will be able to continue to hold power in Israel and certainly to continue prosecuting this war in Gaza.
I want to shift gears slightly, Sherwin, and talk about, how the intense college protests have been playing out at various universities in the U.S. Just give us a sense of, how these pro-Palestine protests are playing out currently, and of course, the response by both institutions as well as law enforcement.
Look, if there was an albatross around President Joe Biden seeking re-election this year, then let's point to these protests that are proliferating around the United States. It started at Columbia University here in New York. You saw it then spread to New York University. It's now at George Washington in Washington, D.C. It's in Washington State across on the West Coast, UCLA in Los Angeles, University of Southern California, universities in Texas, in Virginia, Boston, Brown, Yale, Harvard University, you name it, there's a protest happening at those universities. And what these protesters are seeking essentially is that these universities with massive endowment funds put their money in, invest their money in certain institutions, in certain companies that they believe are supporting Israel's prosecution of its war in Gaza. So they're looking at the money, they're following the money, and they are refusing to budge. The tent encampment that was set up about 2 weeks ago at Columbia, they sent the police in, but the students are now back there, and negotiations, we understand, between administrations at universities and the student protesters are continuing. There have been instances of anti-Semitic tropes being used by protesters. The question is, were these student protesters or were these people infiltrating the protesters, these university protests from outside? But this is an ongoing protest. And let me tell you that students have been very clear that these protests are not going to go away unless there is a ceasefire in Gaza. And what are we hearing from Israeli authorities right now? That a Rafah military offensive, that enclave in the south of Gaza, where some 2 million people are holed up because much of the rest of Gaza has been destroyed, They are very focused on trying to prevent this military escalation in Rafah, but the Israelis are saying they're going to move ahead, and the protesters are saying if that were to happen, they are certainly not going to be going away anytime soon. And as we mentioned at the beginning of that answer, Unati, the broader implications are that this is very much a big concern for the incumbency of President Joe Biden, given that we are in an election year, and many of these protesters would have voted for him in 2020, and they're saying they're not going to be voting for him, given the U.S. intransigence in terms of bringing this conflict in Gaza to an end.
And I suppose we'll see how that plays out in November this year. Sherwin, thank you so much for that. Of course, Sherwin Bryce-Pease coming to us live there from New York, giving us various views of what is playing out in the Middle East issue. Of course, as reports we are hearing of this imminent arrest warrants issuing out for both Benjamin Netanyahu and other officials within Israel, as well as Hamas. But let's give you now a sense of other stories that we are tracking for you and give you an update, in fact, on a story that we have been reporting for you over the past weeks. The remains of the Botswana nationals who died in a bus crash in Limpopo over the Easter weekend will be repatriated tomorrow to Botswana. Now, this is after the remains of all 45 victims were identified.